This move immediately claims central space and opens diagonals for the queen and bishop, setting the stage for rapid development and an active game. 1. c5 immediately challenges white's central pawn and leads to the Sicilian defense. The most popular and aggressive response to 1. e4, creating asymmetrical pawn structures and rich tactical possibilities. This move initiates the Sicilian defense, a popular and aggressive response by black, and white's nf3 is a flexible developing move that prepares for various common continuations, often aiming to control the d4 square and support a central pawn push. This move, nc6, firmly establishes control over the central d4 square and prepares for potential pawn breaks, entering the main line of the open Sicilian defense. This move initiates the open Sicilian, a highly theoretical and sharp battleground where white immediately challenges black's central pawn and aims to gain space and initiative. This move, cxd4, correctly resolves the central tension initiated by white's d4 pawn, opening the c-file for black and challenging white's central pawn majority. This move initiates the main line of the open Sicilian, immediately challenging black's central pawn and opening lines for white's pieces to develop actively. Developing the knight to f6 is a natural Sicilian defense move, challenging white's central pawn and preparing to castle, directly contesting the center. This move, nc3, is a core development in the open Sicilian, aiming to control central squares and prepare for further piece activity. This move, 5, d6, transitions into the classical variation of the Sicilian defense, a solid and popular choice that prepares to develop the bishop to e7 and castle kingside, establishing a robust pawn structure. This developing move prepares to castle kingside and supports the central pawn majority after the Sicilian exchange variation has been accepted. This move, 6, e5, immediately challenges white's central knight and aims to gain space on the kingside, entering a main line of the classical Sicilian defense. This move strategically repositions the knight from the central d4 square to the queenside b3, a typical maneuver in the Sicilian defense's Najdorf variation to prepare for potential queenside expansion or to avoid tactical complications arising from black's central pawn push. This move develops the bishop to a natural square, preparing to castle and solidifying the pawn structure while maintaining flexibility. Castling kingside consolidates the king's position, connects the rooks, and prepares for potential central action or expansion on the queenside. Black castles kingside, mirroring white's king safety move and preparing to connect the rooks while keeping the king out of the central lines that may open later. This move subtly improves the king's safety by moving it off the potentially dangerous g1a7 diagonal, preparing for a potential pawn push on the kingside or to facilitate other piece development. This move, b6, reinforces the d5 square, preparing to develop the queenside knight and potentially challenge white's central control by activating the bishop on the long diagonal. This move ignites the pawn chain and seeks to exploit black's slightly underdeveloped queenside, aiming for an aggressive initiative on the kingside. This capture on f4, while seemingly forcing white to recapture, releases the central tension and allows white to regain pawn presence and potentially prepare for further central pawn advances or piece activity. This recapture on f4 re-establishes white's central pawn presence and opens the g1a7 diagonal for the queen, potentially preparing a kingside attack after developing the bishop. This move is a critical central pawn break, aiming to open lines and challenge white's piece coordination, characteristic of many Sicilian defense variations. This move, 12. e5 aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and gain space in the center, forcing the knight to retreat and potentially opening lines for white's pieces. This move, 12, Knave4, strategically repositions the knight to a more active central square, challenging white's pawn on e5 and preparing for potential counterplay in the center. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, preparing to challenge black's knight and potentially open the b1h7 diagonal for future operations. This move challenges white's centralized knight and aims to simplify the position, potentially freeing up black's pieces. This pawn capture opens the b-file for your rook and creates a doubled c-pawn, which can be a weakness but also offers the potential for active play and control of central squares. This move challenges white's central pawn control by preparing to attack the e5 pawn and potentially open the e-file for the rook. This move repositions the knight to a more active central square, preparing to contest the d5 pawn and potentially launch an attack on the kingside. Developing the queen to d7 supports the knight on e4 and prepares to contest the d-file should it open. This move prepares to challenge black's control of the open c-file and potentially support a queenside pawn push. This exchange aims to simplify the position and gain a tempo by forcing white's knight to recapture, potentially clearing lines for black's rooks. This move reopens the c-file for white's rook and solidifies the pawn chain, creating long-term structural advantages while also potentially preparing for kingside attack. The move 17, Rec 8 is a logical step to activate the rook on an open file, contesting the c-file and preparing to pressure white's queenside pawn structure. This move shifts the bishop to a more active square, preparing to challenge black's control of the d-file and potentially support an eventual c4 pawn push. The move 18, rc7 is a defensive maneuver that aims to protect the c-pawn and prepare to potentially contest the c-file if it opens, while also freeing the rook from the second rank. This move attempts to displace black's rook from the vital c7 square, forcing it to retreat and potentially weakening black's queenside pawn structure. This move is a defensive reaction to white's pressure on the queenside, aiming to unpin the c7 rook and challenge the bishop on a5, though it weakens the queenside pawn structure and creates potential targets on the b-file. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, pressuring black's queenside pawn structure and preparing to contest the vital c-file. This move simplifies the position by exchanging a bishop for a knight, aiming to improve black's pawn structure and potentially activate the rook on the c-file by removing white's active bishop. This move reclaims the rook that was sacrificed to remove white's dangerous bishop, activating the rook on an open file and aiming to put pressure on black's queenside. The move 21, bg4 aims to challenge white's well-placed bishop on b4 and create counterplay by indirectly attacking the d4 pawn and preparing to activate the bishop along the a7-1 diagonal. This move prepares to redeploy the queen to a more active square, likely c3, to pressure black's queenside pawns and potentially support a central pawn advance. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square on the long diagonal, eyeing white's kingside and preparing for potential advances or piece exchanges. This rook move prepares to defend the b7 pawn while simultaneously repositioning the rook to a more active file on the queenside. This move introduces immediate tactical pressure, threatening the vulnerable bishop on b4 and forcing white to commit to a defensive maneuver or a potentially weakening pawn advance. This move repositions the rook to the c-file, aiming to contest control of this open file and potentially support a future advance of the c-pawn, or apply pressure on black's queenside. This capture on c3 is a decisive tactical sequence, eliminating white's protected passed pawn and opening the c-file for black's rooks, aiming to disrupt white's queenside pawn structure. This capture opens the c-file, giving white an active rook and challenging black's control of the central squares. The move 25, rc8 aims to contest the crucial open c-file, preparing to challenge white's rook and potentially exchange pieces to simplify the position while preventing white from dominating the central file. This move repositions the queen to control the open c-file and potentially pressure black's queenside pawns, while also preparing for future pawn pushes or piece activity. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, potentially creating threats on the c-file or supporting a future pawn advance on the queenside. This move aims to activate the queen into the center, attacking the opponent's rook and preparing for a potential queenside expansion or central breakthrough. This move initiates an aggressive pawn push on the queenside, aiming to gain space and potentially create a passed pawn, while also opening lines for the queen and rook. This move addresses the immediate tactical threat on the g-pawn and prevents black from potentially creating further complications on the kingside with their bishop. Black repositions the queen to the active 7th rank, potentially preparing to contest the d-file and supporting the advance of the a-pawn. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, eyeing the queenside and potentially preparing to support a kingside initiative while keeping an eye on the open c-file. This move prepares to reinforce the kingside pawn structure, preventing potential breakthroughs by white's queen and bishops on the h-file and g-file. The move rf2 prepares to double rooks on the f-file, aiming to pressure black's f7 pawn and potentially open lines for attack against the black king. The rook on c7 aims to support the pawn on c5 and potentially activate itself on the c-file, putting pressure on white's isolated queenside pawn. This move is a defensive maneuver, shifting the king to a safer square on h2, preparing to support the rook on the f-file and avoid any potential checks or tactics along the first rank. This move repositions the queen to a more active central square, eyeing the weakened pawns on white's queenside and preparing to contest control of the open c-file. This move simplifies the position by exchanging a bishop for a knight, reducing black's attacking potential while opening the diagonal for white's rook on the c-file. This move recaptures the bishop, opening the queen's file for potential activity and reinforcing the central pawn majority. This move centralizes the queen, preparing to exploit the open c-file and potentially attack black's weakened pawn structure on the queenside. The queen repositions to centralize and potentially support advances on the kingside, while also keeping an eye on the d6 pawn and the potential for exchanges. The queen repositions to g3, preparing to support an advance on the kingside or to potentially pressure black's now vulnerable f7 pawn, while also keeping an eye on the potential for a central pawn push. The move 34, kf8 aims to improve the king's safety by moving it away from the vulnerable central files, potentially preparing for a more active role or to escape potential threats along the dark squares. This move aims to solidify white's pawn structure in the center, preparing to challenge black's queen and potentially open up the c-file for a rook. The move 35, rc6 prepares to reinforce the a5 pawn and potentially support a kingside advance or simply consolidate the rook's position on a more active file, though it does open up the d-file for white. This move repositions the rook to a more active file, potentially supporting pawn advances or attacking black's king in the center. This move immediately challenges white's rook on f2, aiming to disrupt white's coordination and potentially exchange pieces to ease black's defensive burden. This aggressive rook move immediately contests the g-file, forcing black to respond and potentially opening lines for white's attack on the black king. This pawn move weakens the kingside pawn structure, creating potential targets for white's pieces on g5 and f6. And it seems to be a desperate attempt to gain space and complicate the position rather than a sound positional improvement. This move repositions the queen to a more active central square, directly attacking the g6 bishop and preparing to support a potential pawn push on the kingside, while also keeping an eye on the c3 pawn. This move initiates a pawn break in the center, challenging white's central control and aiming to open lines for black's rook and bishop. This exchange of pawns, while seemingly simple, opens up the g-file for your rook, creating immediate attacking potential against black's king. This move, 39, qxf6, recaptures a pawn and centralizes the queen, creating threats against white's king while contesting the open f-file. This move repositions the rook to a more active square, aiming to control the third rank and potentially support the g-pawn's advance. This move repositions the king to a more active square, preparing for potential defensive duties or to join the fight on the kingside while also clearing the way for potential pawn advances. The rook repositions to a more active file, aiming to pressure black's kingside and potentially support a kingside advance. This move is a crucial tempo-gaining check that forces white's king to a slightly more exposed square, allowing black to consolidate its pieces and potentially prepare for an attack on the weakened kingside. The king's relocation to g1 prepares for potential attacks or defensive maneuvers along the h-file, while also creating a safe square for the king should the f-file become more active. This move challenges white's centralized king and attempts to create counterplay on the queenside, potentially opening lines for black's remaining pieces and gaining space. This move aims to disrupt black's pawn chain on the kingside, potentially creating weaknesses and opening lines for white's pieces to penetrate. This pawn capture on h4 opens the g-file and creates a passed pawn on the h-file for black. But it also weakens the kingside pawn structure and could lead to tactical complications. This move directly attacks the opponent's weak pawn on h4 and aims to disrupt their kingside pawn structure, potentially opening lines for white's queen and rooks. This move is a strategic repositioning of the queen to a more active central square, preparing to contest the open files and support the rook on g3. The king retreats to the safety of the h2 square, away from potential checks along the g-file and preparing for potential pawn pushes on the kingside. Black's queen now retreats to a safer square, preparing to defend the weakened kingside pawn structure and potentially support a future pawn advance on the queenside. This capture exploits the unprotected state of black's pawn on d5, initiating a decisive material advantage and disrupting black's pawn structure. This move forces the white king to a more active square, potentially creating counterplay on the queenside or in the center. This move simplifies the position by trading queens, aiming to utilize white's king activity and potentially create a passed pawn on the queenside in the ensuing endgame. The exchange of queens leads to an endgame where white will have a pawn advantage, but black has a more connected pawn structure to potentially defend. This move aims to create a passed pawn on the a-file, potentially liberating the queenside and generating counterplay for white's king in the endgame. This move initiates a positional struggle in the endgame, with black aiming to utilize the c-file to potentially harass white's king and disrupt white's pawn. Structure. The current position features a simplified endgame with opposite-colored bishops, a scenario where the king's activity becomes paramount for creating attacking chances and defending. Weaknesses. This move prepares to activate the rook on the c-file, potentially supporting a pawn advance or challenging white's control of the open file. White's king advances decisively into the center, initiating a dangerous pawn race and threatening to overwhelm black's weakened king. The white king is now exposed, making it a target for the black king as it advances to potentially support its passed pawn and attack white's weakened structure. This move aims to centralize the king to a more active position, allowing it to potentially participate in endgame action and defend weaknesses on the kingside. The king boldly advances to g5, aiming to centralize and become an active participant in the endgame, although this also exposes it to potential checks on the diagonal. This move advances the central pawn to control more space and create a passed pawn, while also potentially opening lines for the queen. The rook repositions to defend the crucial 7th rank, preventing white from establishing further control and preparing for potential counterplay along the open c-file or by targeting white's weakened pawn structure. This pawn push is critical, aiming to create a passed pawn and restrict black's king's mobility, potentially leading to a decisive endgame advantage. The rook, now on the 7th rank, aims to support the advance of the d-pawn and create complications, though it also potentially exposes itself to future threats. This move aims to centralize the rook and prepare to support the passed d-pawn, which will likely become a significant threat in the endgame. The move prepares to support the advanced passed pawn on d6 and potentially redeploy the king to a more active square like f6 to contest the center. The king retreats to a safer square on the kingside, aiming to protect its pawns and prepare for potential pawn advances on the queenside. This move activates the king, bringing it closer to the center where it can support the central pawns and potentially participate in defending against white's passed pawn. The rook move to d1 aims to reroute the rook to support the d-pawn's advance, which is crucial for creating a passed pawn in this endgame scenario. The king ventures into the center, seeking active participation in the endgame and to potentially support its central pawns and fight for squares. This move aims to activate the king by bringing it into a more central and aggressive position, ready to support the pawn on d5 and potentially participate in future pawn races or exchanges.